knows.
Stay the ground, but could not found the perfect ball.
Just give me one good look up to your face. Now that you're floating there in outer space, no way to see it from my point of view. I need to know what I'm living through. You leave us lost if you can't be found. All that I know is we're on the ground, where we both speed up, slow down, overtake. Only one face revealed as you rotate. No gyroscope for us to put you round. Wasting my cool if more reflects it down. We spin so fast yet we cannot feel. Is this merry-go-round really real? Round, round, wherever we go. But where do we go from here?
Does anyone know?
Up, up, no, we go. If we pass through the atmosphere, how far can we go? Round the carousel goes. If we're spinning, one thing is clear: we're spinning out of control. Gravity shows, but
By the
until
end of the
it's not
19th
clear.
century, the triumph of the Copernican system seemed complete. Only one tiny detail had eluded the experimenters. Physics at the time, including Maxwell's famous equations for electrodynamics, was based on the assumption that space was filled with a substance, an ether through which light and other electromagnetic waves would propagate. But all attempts to directly measure the motion of the Earth around the Sun through this ether had paradoxically resulted in an apparent velocity of 0. The stage was set for one of the most important events in the history of physics, the Michelson-Morley experiment.
1887 Michelson-Morley experiment. If the Earth were moving through an ether, then a sort of ether wind would be created at the surface of the Earth. A light beam projected directly into this ether wind would be expected to move slower than a light beam projected across the ether wind. If we project the beams across a known distance and then recombine them, we would expect the two waves to be out of phase by an amount that would tell us the distance the Earth had moved.
If the Earth is moving through the ether, then light waves going one direction relative to us should travel at a different speed than another direction. It's like if you're in a fast-moving river and you're swimming along with the current, you're swimming much faster relative to the shore than if you're swimming against the current. So what the Michelson-Morley experiment was designed to do was measure the speed of light in one direction versus another direction to see how fast we're moving through the ether. And what it discovered was it's the same in one direction as the other.
Michelson-Morley couldn't measure any effect of Earth's orbit, even though the assumption was at the time that that would affect the measured speed of light.
The experiment failed to detect the Earth moving in or against the ether. The problem was serious. Although various solutions were advanced, in the end, science was faced with a choice. Either discard the ether or admit that the Earth wasn't orbiting the Sun. It was Albert Einstein who came up with the solution, which now forms the basis of our physics.
In 1887, an experiment shattered the scientific community. Michelson and Morley tried to check the speed of the Earth through the ether as it orbited the Sun by passing light in two directions, one in the direction of the Earth's travel and one at right angles, and then comparing them for differences. They expected to measure a speed of about 30 kilometers per second. To their amazement, there was no movement of this order. They called it a null result. They actually measured 1 to 10 kilometers per second. but it was still called a null result. They rushed out the theory called the Fitzgerald-Lorentz contraction. This claimed that the tube in line with the direction of movement shortens as it moves through the ether. There was no evidence whatsoever for this. It was only a way of getting over the implication that the Earth was stationary. Later, in 1905 and 1915, Einstein produced his relativity theories, which overcame the troublesome Michelson-Morley experiment by simply abolishing the ether. The whole theory is riddled with contradictions and problems. In 1913, Sagnac carried out a simple experiment of passing light in opposite directions around a table and recombining them. This produced interference fringes. He then rotated the whole table at 2 revolutions per second and found that the fringes changed. This result has very significant implications in science. It works as follows. A beam of light leaves the light source at the bottom left-hand corner and is split into 2 different beams, which we have coloured red and blue just to distinguish them. They travel round the circuit in opposite directions until they eventually reach the splitter, which also recombines them. There they then go on to the photographic plate, where they have interference fringes. In this simplified version, we see that the beam is split into 2, the red and the blue again, and they go round the circuit and are recombined at the splitter and recombining prism, so that they again produce the fringes on the photographic plate. Now let us rotate the table. Before we do so, there is the very important subject of the effect of the ether. The Michelson-Morley experiment failed to detect the 30 kilometers per second motion of the Earth through the ether. So as to overcome this problem, Einstein simply abolished the ether in his relativity theory. The very significant result of the Sagnac experiment was that it proved that the ether existed. Let us see how it did this. It is a fundamental feature of relativity that it claims that as there is no ether, light travels away from a source at the same speed relative to the source, whether the source is moving or not. Thus, whether the table is turning or not, the fringe patterns should stay the same. But if the ether exists, once the light has left the source, the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the speed of the table, mirrors, etc., as we see here. So let us see what happens when we rotate the table. Here, the light is split, and the red and blue lights go in opposite directions. But notice that the left-hand mirror has moved around in such a direction that the distance the red light has to travel is further. Now in relativity, the same time should be taken because the splitter is also moving and the distance between them is the same. But now imagine that the ether exists and the speed of the light is controlled by the stationary ether. Imagine the ether like a thick treacle that limits how fast the light can travel, independent of the motion of the light source, the splitter, or the mirrors. The result is that the red light takes longer to reach the left-hand mirror. Similarly, the right-hand mirror is coming towards the blue light, so it reaches the mirror quicker. After they change ends, the red light again takes longer to reach the recombiner, whilst the blue light gets there quicker again. So they reach the photographic plate with a delay between them, and this changes the fringe pattern. In fact, Sagnac, using the speed of the rotation of the table, calculated how much the fringes should change, and found that they did change by just that amount. The crucial feature of this experiment is that it demonstrates that the ether does exist, which demolishes relativity. How does the scientific establishment deal with this result? By muddying the waters with scientific gobbledygook. Wikipedia says, in the above discussion, the rotation mentioned is a rotation with respect to an inertial reference frame. Since this experiment does not involve a relativistic velocity, the same wording is valid both in the context of classical electrodynamics and special relativity. How on earth can it be valid in both theories? It clearly proves that the ether exists because the speed of the light is controlled by the ether, independent of the rotating table and mirrors. This Sagnac effect is used by airlines for their compass directions. As the plane turns, the change in the fringes are translated into a change in the direction of the plane that then registers on the cockpit compass.
Scientific proof the Earth does not move. Many attempts were made to prove that heliocentricity was true and geocentricity was false. Every such attempt has been a failure. The most famous, because of its precision and irrefutability, was the experiment done by physicist A. Michelson, 1852 through 1931, and chemist E. W. Morley, 1838 through 1923. The Michelson-Morley experiment, using an interferometer which measured light rays, established that the Earth is stationary. Michelson was involved in other experiments that confirmed, to his dismay, that the Earth is stationary. The Michelson-Morley experiment, 1887, does not stand alone. It is joined in its confirmation of a stationary Earth by the James Bradley experiment, 1729, proving that the ether is not carried along by the Earth, the Sagnac experiment, 1913, proving that there was in fact an ether, the Michelson-Gale experiment, 1925, proving that the ether passed over the Earth once every 24 hours, and Airy's failure, 1871, proving that the stars moved carried by the ether while the Earth remained stationary. There are many other experiments that have each time given results that were not only consistent with a stationary Earth, but indicative of a stationary Earth. From the light polarization experiments of E. Muscart in 1872 to the mutual inductance experiments of Theodore de Coudres in 1889 to the 1903 Teuton-Noble experiments. Indeed, there is not a single experiment that proves that the Earth moves. The moving Earth is based entirely on a theory and is contradicted by all of the experimental evidence. The Sagnac experiment, proving the existence of ether, destroys the theory of relativity, which necessarily assumes that there is no ether. The Michelson-Gale experiment proved that the ether passed over the Earth once every 24 hours, but it did not prove whether it was the ether moving or the Earth spinning. Airy's failure determined with scientific certainty that in fact it was the ether carrying the stars that was moving over the Earth, and that the Earth was stationary. Dr. Neville Thomas Jones, Ph.D., explains that George Airy proved that the world was stationary and the stars are moving. Because his experiment proved that the Earth does not move, which was the opposite of the expected outcome, Airy's experiment is commonly known as Airy's failure. There has been a virtual blackout, however, within science education of these experiments. Dr. Malcolm Bowden reveals that he asked 3 Christian physicists if they had ever heard of them. Not one had. Indeed, in March 2005, another physicist wrote to Dr. Bowden that, quote, "After 35 years as a professional physicist with a thesis in relativity, I only learned of Sagnac's experiment last year." Close quote. The degree of the cover-up of true science is simply astounding. The Michelson-Morley experiment was simple in concept. A light beam was split. One of the split beams was sent at a right angle to the Earth's supposed direction of travel, and the other was sent along the path of the Earth's supposed direction of travel. The light traveling in the direction of the Earth's travel should have taken longer than the light traveling at right angles to the Earth's direction of travel. To the amazement of the scientific world, the results were null, meaning that there was no difference in the speed of the light beams. That meant that the Earth was motionless. The Michelson-Morley experiment shook the scientific world. The implications were devastating for the Copernican model of a globular, spinning Earth orbiting around the sun. If the heliocentric model fell, then evolution would not be far behind. The priests of science knew that something had to be done if they were going to maintain their godless religion. In desperation, the priests of science tried to explain away the null result of the Michelson-Morley experiment. Hendrie A. Lorenz and George Fitzgerald swallowed their pride and put their formerly good names to a ridiculous theory that the null result in the Michelson-Morley experiment was because the solid steel arm that was pointed in the direction of the supposed motion of the Earth became shorter due to the Earth's movement through the ether. That shortening of the steel caused the light to arrive at the same time, not because the Earth was stationary, but because the Earth was moving. Seriously, I'm not making this up. This supposed contraction became known as the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction. There was absolutely no evidence to support the theory of the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction, but it was all they had to try to keep the spinning and orbiting Earth model of heliocentricity alive. They only came up with the theory of the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction because they had nothing else to explain the null result, and they were not going to abandon the Copernican model. Some scientists aver that it is a misnomer to call the Lorentz-Fitzgerald theory a contraction, since as first theorized, it was supposedly the transverse arm of the Michelson-Morley interferometer that was lengthened, so it should actually be called the Lorentz-Fitzgerald expansion. Regardless, if it was called an expansion or a contraction, it was an inane theory that was unsupported by any proof. Arthur Miller described the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction as physics of desperation. Indeed, it was more akin to a fairy tale for adults than it was science. It was not long before Einstein was pressed into service with his theory of relativity. Notice that the scientific community rejected acceptance of a stationary Earth, not because there was any scientific evidence that contradicted it, but because it had become the central faith of the godless scientific community. The Copernican theory was simply not to be abandoned, no matter what the scientific evidence showed. Einstein to the rescue. Something had to be done about the results of the Michelson-Morley experiment. The high priests of science simply could not allow the world to discover that the Earth did not move. Enter Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity. Einstein announced his special theory of relativity in 1905 and his general theory of relativity in 1915. Einstein's theory of relativity was able to explain away the null results of the Michelson-Morley experiment. According to Einstein, the speed of light is constant, and consequently, an object moving through space would not show movement if light was used to measure the speed of the motion. According to Einstein, the speed of light is constant for every observer, no matter what speed the observer is traveling. Armed with the theory of relativity, scientists argued that the Earth was moving despite the null result of the Michelson-Morley experiment. They alleged that it was incorrectly shown not to be moving in the Michelson-Morley experiment because the light used in the experiment, which was expected to show the speed of the Earth through the ether, could neither increase nor decrease in speed. The Michelson-Morley experiment was designed to measure the expected speed of the supposedly moving Earth through the ether. Einstein could not have a constant speed of light, as he theorized, if there was an ether. Einstein solved that issue by simply announcing that there was no ether. Einstein, by theorizing that there is a constant speed of light and there is no ether, solved the Michelson-Morley null movement result and saved the heliocentric model of an orbiting, rotating Earth.